Good morning, everyone. A blessed day to you all. My name is Sherwin Ellis. I'm a senior human resource officer here at the Learning and Development Directorate of the Ministry of the Public Service. And I want to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Government's Digitization Initiative, What You Need to Know. I am your moderator for this webinar presentation and the discussion that will follow. The Learning and Development Directorate, Ministry of the Public Service, in collaboration with the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Smart Technology, is proud to present this webinar presentation. We would like to hear your voice and would like to include you in the conversation that we're going to be having later this morning. But before we get there, here are some ground rules that we want to share with you as we begin the presentation. Please note that there will be time allotted at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. So you can type your questions in the chat box and willingly share your comments. Kindly note that this chat option can be seen at the bottom of your screen, and I will be monitoring it to ensure that those questions that you share will be taken, and at the end of the question and during the question and answer section, I will pass them on to the presenter. Please also note that we are recording the presentation and it will be made available to you. What I'd like you to do is mute your microphone, disable your video, pause and minimize distractions as much as possible. Focus fully on the presentation. Share what you have learned in the chat, as well as reflect on your own experiences, and please participate. At this point, I want to introduce our presenter for this webinar, Mr. Hazley Strawn, E-Government Development Officer, the E-Government Unit of the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Smart Technology. Mr. Strawn started his public service career almost 20 years ago in the Office of Public Sector Reform. And it was during those 10 years that he has gained valuable experience and knowledge in records and information management, organizational reviews, strategic planning, public sector management, and public sector modernization. The second half of Mr. Strawn's career has seen him transition from a management development officer to e-government development officer, with the responsibility of assisting ministries, departments, and agencies with the development and implementation of e-government solutions. He is presently a member of government's Digitization Committee, and Mr. Strawn is the holder of an MBA from the University of Surrey in IT project management. He is also certified in knowledge management and records information management. It is at this point I hand you over to our presenter, Mr. Strawn. Mr. Strawn?
Good morning. Thank you, Sherry. And thank you to the Learning and Development Directorate team for affording me this opportunity to present this webinar this morning. Before we start, I would like to basically go through the objective of the seminar. So by the end of the seminar, we should be able to develop an understanding of government digitalization initiative, identify the benefits of digitalization, outline the stages in the digitalization process, and be able to select records for digitalization. So what I'm going to do this morning is ask get some participation from my colleagues. So I will ask you to look at the question on screen now. How will digitalization benefit you as a public officer? So you can go, I will give you 30 seconds to at least put a response in the chat. And we will discuss some of your responses before proceeding.
How will digitalization benefit you as a public officer?
All right, we should be at least seeing some comments now.
Yes, Mr. Strawn, I'm seeing some comments here coming in. Some colleagues are stating that that information would be readily available. There will be easier access to records. There will be public officer access. It will make file sharing easier. The required information would be readily available. There is also easier access retrieval. You're able to respond to information in a very timely manner, as well as also to increasing productivity while making work easier and available. As well, greater efficiency and transparency. The output rate would be improved. I'm saying that that's an excellent comment as well also too. Less dust to deal with.
That's a good one.
Faster access to files, timely response to customers.
Yes. So basically all those responses are definitely correct. And what I will do now is actually go through why digitize now. And I will build upon what was said earlier in the chat. So the government of Barbados is committed to modernizing the public service and enhancing its delivery of vital services to its citizens, employees, and customers. So going forward, we all know that for the last couple of years, we were working in conditions where obviously all the records were basically paper-based. So we are now at a stage where, as the country develops, as we are now in the competitive world, we must basically put our country in line to be competitive. So the government of Barbados is committed to modernizing the public service and enhancing its delivery of vital services. And to this end, the government has implemented the Barbados Economic and Recovery Transformation Program, better known as BERT. We are all familiar with the BERT program. Through BERT, the government is aiming to restore economic stability. A key component of this plan is to modernize the public sector through the utilization of information and communication technology. To assist with this modernization effort, the government has embarked on an ambitious digitization program initiative and has signed a US $40 million loan contract with the Inter-American Development Bank to fund, and you will hear a lot more about this here going forward, the public sector modernization program. So I would go into more specifics in terms of why digitize at this time. So let us look at the latest Doing Business report. As you can see, Barbados is currently ranked 128th out of 190 countries in terms of the ease of doing business. This has been deemed obviously unacceptable by the government, since all of the indicators in the diagram involve some form of government processes or regulation. Unfortunately, as I said before, most of the processes are still very much paper-based, and therefore digitization is important to set the foundation for this transformation effort, hence the digitization program. So basically doing such now would redound to a better ranking for Barbados, obviously. So that is another reason why digitizing now is customer expectation. So you will find today, most citizens and customers are undergoing their own digital transformation and have become comfortable in using technology in their everyday lives. So I'm sure that every one of our colleagues are accustomed using internet banking. We are accustomed to using Amazon to make purchases. We are accustomed, obviously, from, as the term, as the cliche what goes, moving from in-line to online. So therefore, citizens are expecting and demanding more from the government. And it means the government must provide the same level of service that we get from the private sector and from e-commerce platforms. So I would argue that government can no longer just provide a one-channel or over-the-counter interaction, as is the case now. So we need to move towards these services. And it means that government records and processes must be digitized. This is a factor that is, it's very important, and I think that everyone in the public sector should know that when it comes to our e-readiness in terms of the use of technology, we are doing fairly well. So today, most citizens, my apologies, so two factors, will support the ability of the public to utilize digital technology. And these two factors are the high mobile penetration rate. So we know that basically in some cases, persons will have 2 or more cell phones, right? Our access to internet, that's another reason that will encourage us to utilize our digital services. And if you look at the chart to the right, you will realize that in terms of our mobile penetration rate, that a rate of 117, we have a internet penetration rate of 117%, which is basically above the regional average. So as you can see there on the Caribbean is at 77%. Even North America, which is USA and Canada, has a penetration rate of 106%. We are at 117. So at least from a perspective in terms of mobility is not a challenge in terms of our country. Regarding the penetration rate is actually estimated at 82%, or 234,000 internet users. And when we do the global comparison again, we are definitely above the global average. So again, the Caribbean penetration rate is 60%, Central America at 66%, North America is actually at 88%. And when you go to the other continents, you'll see in Central America, in Southeast Asia is 66%. So we are doing it fairly well. Only countries that basically have a greater penetration rate will be Northern Europe, Western Europe, and North America. So that is one indicator that we are doing fairly well. So what does this mean? This means that as a government offer more digital services, the population will have the means to access these services. For example, in a country with a low mobile or internet penetration rate, concentrating on digital transformation will have to start with bridging the digital divide. So in other countries, you will find that don't have access to technology, don't have access to mobile phone and internet. They cannot necessarily start talking about digitalization and digital transformation unless they start to address or bridge the gap in terms of access to technology. Now, the COVID crisis. The COVID crisis has basically propelled some public sector entities or agencies into the digital age. As you can see from my little question there, who led the digital transformation in your company? I guess in this case, you can say in your agency. And obviously the overwhelming answer will be C, COVID-19. What we are seeing in all sectors now is actually revolutionary. So in the public service, for instance, it has led to new initiatives like working from home and utilizing virtual tools like Zoom that we're using now and Microsoft Teams. And I would like to speak a little bit more on that because I never envisioned, at least in my public service career, that I would actually have the opportunity to work from home. All right, and I guess fortunately or unfortunately, the COVID crisis has propelled some persons who obviously their job description and stuff afford them to work from home and their job tasks. So I would say that was something that was definitely did not see on the cards, and I would say that from feedback from some of my other colleagues who are working from home, it was actually very productive, and it's something that we could obviously look forward to putting formal policies in place to make it a formality. Right, and another example in terms of transforming the government services is this seminar. I am sure that before arranging a seminar like this would involve some face-to-face interaction, and the number of persons that we would have obviously targeted would have been just the size of the classroom. So we talk about 30 persons or less. But now, because we are using this type of technology, this virtual technology, virtual meetings, we can now target hundreds of participants. And the good thing about these tools is that also it allows for feedback. So it's not necessarily one-way communication, but there's also room to interact. So, and what's kind of interesting now is that this tool, Zoom, Microsoft Teams and stuff, are now becoming the new norm because I'm now having more virtual meetings than actual physical meetings. So a physical meeting now is not the norm. And all that happens within the space of 3 months because of the COVID-19 crisis. And if you look at education, for instance, we saw the transformation of the education sector, where now the Ministry of Education is utilizing Google Classroom. And that is something that obviously was spoken about in the last couple of years of actually using technology in the classroom. And because of this crisis, we had no choice. So now it's been basically interacting now with the teacher and stuff virtually has become the norm in the last couple of months. And even in the media, you can see the disappearing now of actual panel discussions. Panel discussion now are basically have virtually, where persons calling via Zoom, Teams, or any other virtual platform and having virtual discussion. So in terms of communication systems, you will obviously seeing the rise now of and the popularity, and they keep mentioning all the time of these tools, these virtual tools, Zoom, WebEx, Microsoft Teams. And I must say, I'm sure that most of you all out here has been exposed to Microsoft Teams in terms of collaboration, and you can see how such digital tools could really enhance collaboration. And I must say that from a personal perspective, I enjoy using Microsoft Teams to collaborate with my colleagues. Even this session, we did a lot of planning and stuff via Microsoft Teams. So it's now becoming the norm, and it's something that we basically becoming accustomed to. So the benefits of digitalization. In the question that was asked in the first interaction in the chat, a lot of persons actually responded, and a lot of this stuff was mentioned. So I want to mention greater increased productivity, obviously cost efficiency, in that when you introduce technology or digitize, you definitely reduce the cost of the particular service. Ease of access. in terms of ease of access, because you digitize a particular record or digitize a particular process, and speaking from a record's perspective, that record now becomes available to all those who have access simultaneously. So before, if you're dealing with a physical record or physical file, and the file is kept in the cabinet, and the file is taken up or assigned to an officer, only one that has access to that document is that particular officer. So no one have access once it's out to that particular officer. But with technology, now that file can once the person has access, that file can become available to all those who have access to it. So just give me 1 minute. I'm sorry about that, folks. Just we have to put back the presentation. Again, my apologies. All right, so touching now on enhanced security, a scanned document is basically a trackable document. If needed, only certain users can access the document, and workflow can be set up along with permission groups for an individual, which enhances security and maintain the confidentiality of the document. In terms of saving space, that is a given, because you will find in most organizations now, a large footprint is actually taken up for the cabinets. And unfortunately, a lot of these cabinets also contain closed volumes and closed files. So with the advent of digitization and digitizing those records, you know, basically you're going to get rid of all those cabinets and save space. Environmental friendliness speaks for itself in that with using of digital records, you get away now from the constant printing of paper, and definitely it will be better on the environment in that you're actually saving trees. So that speaks for itself. Right, and that should also add to go back to digital recovery. There's always a risk of a disaster, whether it's natural or man-made. It could be a flood, a fire, or earthquake. Right, and the good thing about electronic records is that in the event of a disaster, and if you have obviously a well-planned disaster recovery in place, you can find that the data or the records could be stored off-site or even off-island. And once the disaster strikes, you're able to at least have access to the records to start back your operations. So let me now discuss the whole concept of digitization versus digitalization. And I know that some people usually use these terms interchangeably, but technically speaking, they are actually different. Right? So digitization is basically the process of converting information from one physical format into a digital one. Right? So in most cases, we do it on a daily basis. So if you receive a physical paper document and you basically scan it on your scanner and store it as a PDF on your file server, that is digitization. Digitalization, on the other hand, is the process of leveraging digitization to improve the business process. Right? So just to give you an example, if you actually scan as I said, scan the particular document and you place it in your share folder, or you save it on a file server, and you make that particular document accessible, or share that document to other persons and stuff, that's actually digitalization, in that you actually automated the process. So digitalization speaks to the actual document. Digitalization speaks to the actual process. How's that document accessed? And the digital transformation is the process of devising new business applications that integrate all of the digital data and digitalization application. So that is basically where now you actually develop a customer-centric application where the customer could access or apply for a particular service. That information feeds in to a digitalization system, or it's basically digitalize the information can be accessed into querying the database. No, it could be workflow throughout the organization. So at the end, the actual applicant will get back a response or get back that particular service either electronically. I would say in most cases electronically. So what I want you guys to do now is, based on the definition given, I would like to share with us an example of one of these processes that you are aware of and identify which category it falls into. So what I would do, I would just go back to the definitions, and you can basically place, just give one example of the processes, and if it's actually digitization, if it's actually digitalization, or if it's actually digital transformation. It can speak about some of these services being offered by government now. I'll give you at least a minute to post some responses in the chat.
Again, the question would have been, based on the definition given, what do you consider as digitization, digitalization, and digital transformation? Yes, they're having some comments coming in here based on the definitions given. And you can share your examples. Seen here, paying taxes online. Digitization is the process of making files digital by using PDFs. Digitization is the upload of government passport applications. Digitization again, making forms available online for persons to download, even scanning information. Digital transformation, applying and receiving police certificate of characters. Excellent. Scanning documents, someone has said that is digitization. Again, the posting of the Mercury newspaper of Barbados online for public to use. That is digital transformation.
Good point.
Birth certificates are now available to a person who walks in via digitalization. Providing the official gazette online. Someone here has mentioned as well to submitting PSE5 forms through our CMS system. Converting a paper application form into an online application form. Again, digitization, electronic files, a child data database. Excellent there.
Yes.
Mr. Oxley, the completion of an application process using electronic means, where it was usually done manually, is digitization. And we also have another one here, when audio and video files and programs are shared on various channels and stations to the public. Ms. Lash has commented that that is digitization. Again, someone has also to repeat it, some submitting pay slips online, as opposed to the paper-based approach that we used to take. Digitalization, the accessibility to the general public of passport application forms, and this basically then reduces clutter. Back again over to you, Mr. Moderator.
Yes, so basically all of those examples are indeed correct. And it's basically, I would say, a stages. So the whole aim for any organization or any countries to actually reach the digital transformation phase. But obviously it starts with digitization and basically converting your records or your basic documents into the digital format. And then you said you start to automate the process, you start to actually implement what we call backend systems or business information systems. To basically deal with the processes and workflow within the organization. And that leads to digital transformation when we actually now extend the actual solution from just concentrating on internal processes, we extend it now to your customers and your citizens. So once that's done, you actually transform to the digital transformation. And there are a number of examples that were spoken of. I would like to specifically mention the police certificate of character. Our ministry, the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Smart Technology, work along with the Royal Barbados Police Force in actually moving that process from from a typical paper-based manual process, and we jumped straight to a digital transformation process, and that involved, as you mentioned, digitization in that we actually converted the information into a database. All right, so and you must bear in mind, in all cases, it don't necessarily involve scanning of records, because depending on the type of record, it is a case where that information could be entered into the database as opposed to actually scanning the information and then trying to obviously index the fields and stuff. So things like registers, for instance, registration department, our vital records are usually held in registers. So any digital transformation effort at that entity will involve most likely not necessarily scanning the registers, but actually inputting the information into a system or into a database, right? And that was done in terms of the police. And so now citizens can access that service by basically just going to the application form, filling it out, and basically all the magic happens at the back end, and all that is due to digitalization and digitization, right? There's also some work being done now at lands and survey, and because if you go back to the previous slide, my first or second slide relating to the ease of doing business, there was a concern of actually registration of property. So I know that issue is being addressed by the lands and survey department, who's actually now in the process of starting a digitalization project relating to digitizing of the land records and the maps and so that it will actually enhance that process going forward. So let me now go on to the steps in the digitization process. What I have done is actually separated the various steps into three broad categories. So you can see here there is pre-digitization, digitization, and post-digitization. So the three broad steps. So I will basically go through the activities under each step. So the first activity before we start, always advise agencies and stuff that should at least clean the records, because if you're going to digitize any documents and records, we assume that the record will contain at least some form of dust, at least surface dust. So at least as a minimum, you should clean the records first, right? MIS and the Archives Department has produced a best practice guideline for cleaning and maintenance of records. A copy of this guideline will be is available from any of the entities. What I would do, I will also upload I will forward a copy to Learning and Development, so that at least when we are corresponding back to you guys, so you will have a copy of those guidelines. There is also a list of approved cleaners, which was actually approved by the Archive Department. And I would advise you all to at least touch base with the Archives Department, so that if you want to engage a company to at least carry out the cleaning, that the person meets the standards and stuff of the Archive Department. And that is important because you don't necessarily want to clean up a record is a specialist task. You don't necessarily want to get someone getting a wet cloth and actually wiping the actual files with a damp cloth, and that has happened, because that obviously will cause damage. So that is why we prefer to at least have a approved list from the chief archivist, so that we're competent or comfortable that that particular company or firm meets a certain standard. The next step is actually the inventory of the records. This is a process of gathering information about the records. And in this case, it will be files. This will include information about the title, the date open, the date of last action, the physical condition of the file, and information about the content. This information is crucial since it is needed for the next activity. And that next activity, obviously, and which is a challenge for a lot of us in terms of what records do we need to identify to be digitized. What we have done over the last couple of days was actually done a lot of work in terms of to see how best to address this issue. So the technical team has decided that for expediency, we will digitize records that are no more than 5 years initially, right? And we will also identify, encourage agencies to identify their vital records to be shortlisted for digitization as well. I will discuss more of this in the next slide. So we will go into greater details in just a few minutes in relation to identifying records to be digitized. Boxing and labeling and transportation. This stage is also important because once your records are identified, they must be labeled properly, they must be boxed, and then I must stress that you should really place your records in actual record boxes, and not necessarily a normal box that you get from the supermarket, because they want to make sure that the records are not damaged during transportation. So there are a number, I assume that most persons here will know of obviously record boxes. Some people call them banker boxes, but you must have proper boxes. And also those boxes are designed for proper labeling and stuff as well. So I would encourage you all to, in terms of preparation for digitization, that things like boxing and labeling and stuff should be considered as one of the checklist items. The next step will involve now the actual digitization. And what we are proposing is that we would transport all the records to a centralized scanning bureau for the records to be digitized. So we are not necessarily be digitizing the records on-prem or on your premises, but we want to transport them to an approved site for those records to be digitized. And the first activity under the digitization step is sanitization, or sanitizing, sorry. And this is obviously important, especially in the COVID-19 environment that we are in now. So that would be the first step to protect not just, we want to protect all concerned who will be handling these documents going forward. So we want to make sure that there's a step or process in place where sanitizing will be done before handling of documents. The next step, next activity, sorry, will be document preparation. And document preparation, this involves actually basically taking, I don't want to use the term pulling the file apart, but basically removing the treasury tags, removing the actual file cover from the actual file. So if you're actually scanning files, you must actually pick down the files, and we prefer that to be done within the scanning bureau by persons trained to do that. The next activity is obviously scanning and indexing. I don't think I have to go into details about that. And the document reconstitution, this is where now the actual file or document is actually put back together. And obviously reboxing is where you actually rebox the actual files. And let me say, to be transported to a records center. All right, and then this takes us to the actual final stage, post digitization. I did mention the records center. We are now actively in the process of trying to identify a records center. And the records center is basically a building where semi-active and inactive records are usually stored for entities. A good example which happens in the private sector would be, for instance, I assume we all have heard about Secure Thread. So Secure Thread basically is a record center for a lot of the banks and stuff have stored their semi-active and inactive records, a lot of private sector entities, and I'm certain that some government entities too also utilize the services of Secure Thread for storage. But we are pursuing a government record center because there are a lot of records, especially inactive and closed volume, that in some cases will not necessarily be digitized, that should be stored. Stored so that in case you need to access them and stuff, you can still basically go to the record center or either contact them, and they could basically send back that particular file to you electronically. So that is good. That is actually a key component of our whole digitization program, and it's something that we really need to put in place so that to ease the burden on a lot of entities and a lot of agencies storing records in the basement. I know that I'm certain that some of my colleagues here on this webinar, have files in basement or on the staircases and corridors, but ideally those records should be stored in a record center. The next important step is actually the electronic records should be made available, how they will be made available to the MDAs. So MIS is actually now in the process of piloting an electronic document records management system. And this is being piloted in our agency first, but this system has to roll out now to the entities. At the end of the day, when we digitize the records, those records should be made available to the entity in the electronic format. We don't necessarily want to digitize the records, rebox, and then send back the boxes to the entity for you to start back. You're still using paper. So we are now in the process of devising a plan where these documents and records will be made available to entities and stuff electronically. So that is a key point. So we know that before we get to that stage, a lot of work has to be done in the entity, and we are devising at least a rollout plan for most of the entities and staff who would be going through the digitization process. No, this brings me to the point now in terms of, because we mentioned the term record a lot going forward, in terms of what exactly is a record. And based on the Bahamas National Standard Institute standard, a record is information created, received, and maintained as evidence and as an asset by an organization or person in pursuit of legal obligation or in the transaction of a business. Right, so in most cases, we know that official correspondence, especially memos and letters, will be considered a record. Video recordings, minutes of meetings. I have social media, but I would say more specifically, social media posts that is done by an agency. So, and databases, maps, personal files, invoices, etc. So that is actually a definition of a record. So this now leads us to the next slide in terms of non-records. So non-records are documents or records kept for the purpose of personal reference or convenience. And the example of a non-record would be extra copies of documents. We do that a lot. Outdated product catalogs, worksheets and drafts. So, and you will find if you look at a lot of files, there are a lot of non-records usually attached at cover, which technically speaking should not necessarily be on the file, but usually the person put them on cover. So even in just going back to the stages of digitalization, when you actually select the record for digitalization, we want to encourage the agencies and stuff that at least what we call purge the file, take out all of those non-records, so that when it's transported to the digitalization center for scanning or digitalization, that we don't be scanning non-records. So that's important to distinguish the difference. So we now have a question. What do you categorize as records or non-records in your respective MDAs? I will give you at least a minute to place some comments in the chat for further discussion.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. What I've noticed, what do you consider, or how do you categorize your records and your non-records? I'm saying here, so one person is saying the record is a client information. They classify them, some are saying personal files, correspondence from external agencies. Is that a record or is that a non-record for you? Extra copies of draft financial statements. Yes, good point here. Extra copies of draft financial statements is a non-record. Another non-record could be a product catalog. Permits, medical files, or records. A non-record is a supplies catalog. Someone is here mentioning we have precedent records, which is a record, legislative forms, correspondence on file are records. Records as well are court transcripts and legal documents. Again, a will is a record. A non-record is a draft memo. Employee files are records, personal files. Someone would mention here, outdated brochures is a non-record. Interesting, non-records, someone is saying the official gazette. Circulars is a record, as well as quotations, reports. Draft documents, they're saying now that that is a non-record. Historical records, they would consider that one to be a record. Cabinet papers as well, earning schedules that we submit, even say to the National Insurance Department. Over to you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Sherry. Those were some actually interesting comments. And actually lead me now to the next slide, because I want to discuss now the primary value of records, and that will help clear some matters, because I heard someone mention, for instance, the official gazettes and stuff like that. So you will find in most entities, you usually have what we consider the primary value of the record to the particular entity. So to assist in deciding what to digitize, the value of the record should definitely be considered. So let me look at, for instance, these four types of records within an entity. The first one is fiscal records. Records with fiscal value, documents an agency financial transactions and obligations. So this will include, for instance, the budget records, which show the expenditures that are being planned, vouchers and expenditure records, which indicate the purpose for the funds to be spent, and the accounting records, which classify and summarize the agency's expenditure. So we are all familiar with the records and the accounting records within the entity. So those obviously will have some primary value to the entity. Legal records now relates to records which involve long and short-term rights of a government or of a private citizen, which are enforceable by law and regulations. They are more easily identified than other records. And so an example of these would be contracts, leases, the titles, deeds, treaties, if you're dealing with Ministry of Foreign Affairs, etc. So most legal documents and records are never destroyed and are usually equivalent in value. And I spoke earlier about the whole issue of identifying vital records. So even things like contracts and stuff will be vital and should really be kept separate and identified. The operational records, now this relates to records that support the operation and the management of an organization. They usually relates to the mandate, the role, or the mission of the organization by documenting the duties, the responsibilities, the functions, the activities, and the services performed. So an example of these would be operational manuals, for instance, the procedural manuals of the organization, the strategic plans, the job descriptions, etc. Those are operational records. And finally, the administrative records. All records will have some sort of administrative value because they are necessary to conduct the agency's current business. These are records that support operations and routine management of an organization. So an example of these would be routine correspondence like memos and circulars, the records related to human resources, equipment and supply, property management, reference material, etc. And just going back to the primary value of records as opposed to secondary value, a good example would be information on this seminar. I noticed that the information on this seminar was sent via email to most organizations and most entities. So in that case, that record would you consider that a question I want to put is a question that would you consider that record that was sent to you on this seminar primary record, it has value for your organization. Just a quick 15 seconds in chat. The record relating to this course that was sent by Learning and Development, will you consider that a record of your agency? Yes or no? I'll give you just 15 seconds to reply quickly.
I'm seeing so far they're about the majority are saying no. Some are saying I'm seeing 3 have said yes, but the majority of comments I'm seeing are no.
Right. So the correct
Yeah,
the correct answer in this case would be no. Technically speaking, it would have been primary value to learning and development, because learning and development core function is obviously delivery of courses. So from a learning and development perspective, that is a record for them. But for the entity, it would be considered a non-record in that, technically speaking, it could, you'll find in most cases, it could be placed on a notice board, because it's just basically giving information on a particular course. Some people send it via email blast to other staff members in the organization. So that's why the whole concept of the primary value records is important. So it depends on the entity, on the origin, how the record actually originated. Right. So that will answer some of the questions or some of the records that were placed in chat. And you can think a little further in terms of the official gazettes. The official gazettes are usually sent to a lot of entities and stuff. I didn't know some persons, depending on how organized the person dealing with records, they usually take off the essays and fill them appropriately, because it obviously relates to legislation, pending legislation or acts that have been passed. So technically speaking, I would say yes, those could be considered records, because it have an impact on the organization. So it depends on the value, how you value that particular record, right? So hope that as it clears up, I help assist you in terms of deciding what to digitize. So now move on to at least the question, what to digitize. As I mentioned before, we are really encouraging agencies and stuff to identify their vital record, at least at a minimum. And vital records could be defined as records needed in anywhere from a few minutes or 24 hours after a disaster to get an office up and running again. So records that, if lost or destroyed, would be both costly and time consuming to recreate, if they can be recreated at all. And some you will find in some cases your vital records could be active, and in some cases it could be inactive. So it's actually important that agencies at least identify their vital records for digitization. And then at this point, that I will want to mention that MIS is actually now in talks with Learning and Development Directorate in terms of putting on another course for at least the officers and agency who deals with records, in terms to, so that they'll be able to identify their vital records, and also be given further guidance in terms of how to identify records for digitization. So you can look out for that. That is something that we are at least presently working on, because we know that we need to at least get further information or further training for the officers within the MDAs to assist in terms of making good choices in terms of what to digitize. And as mentioned before, we have, as a team, we have decided that we will basically look at the last 5 years of active records in terms of to identify for initial digitization, right? So those records will be inventory and to remove, as I mentioned before, the non-record and irrelevant documentation. And this will be important so that when those files are actually boxed and transported, only all the contents will be digitized. You don't know, will I have any doubts in terms of no, if this is a record, if it's a non-record, does it make sense? Are there duplicates? Do you have a draft of a particular document on along with the final draft? So things like that we want to at least identify, and at least basically what we term purge the files before we submit them for digitization. I just want to reinforce the point. We are looking to at least provide additional training and resources to agencies to identify their vital records and also further decide what records to digitize. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. So I now hand over to the moderator who will basically moderate in terms of questions being posed in the chat. So thank you very much.
And thank you to Mr. Strawn for that very informative session there. It has been very timely information that you've just delivered there to all of us. And I would say as well too that very enlightening and would therefore hopefully allow us as public officers and colleagues to ensure that that we can, make sure that that our digitization processes and so are in sync. Before we get to those questions, I saw one or two participants or a couple of participants would have been asking about the digitization program guidelines, and that would be made available for you on download from the chat. So we'll ensure that we get that document to you. So it's also at this time, I'll ask you to share your respective questions and so that that you may want me to pose to Mr. Strawn. And I'll be continuing to monitor the chat so that I can post those questions to him. One of the questions I see that came in, Mr. Strawn, would have been, can persons in the individual department be trained in the digitization process? Mr. Strawn?
Yeah.
Question,
good,
right?
Yes, yeah, good question. As I mentioned before, we realized that we cannot at least have a national or public service-wide digitization program if not involving the public officers. Because in most cases, we know that the actual digitization will be outsourced, but there's a role to be played by public officers in terms of what I just described, in terms of actually identifying the records, even the whole issue of quality assurance and making sure that when the records are being inventoried and stuff, that they have a general understanding of what is going on. So we are definitely, as I mentioned before, we are definitely putting together some additional training for officers within entities in terms of, I don't necessarily want to say digitalization, but I would say digitalization / records and information management. You must have a general understanding of records management and how to handle and how to deal with information within the entity. So we are definitely putting together those training programs to benefit public officers. So the answer is definitely yes.
Okay. Another question to follow up on that one. Will this digitization process be suited to the specific or the particular department?
Yes. All entities are technically speaking different. So you will find that although we're going forward in terms of digital transmission or digitization, it depends on the particular entity. And I can give an example. For instance, the police different character will be a good example, where that involves indexing as opposed to scanning, right? So as I said, it depends on each entity is slightly different. So I would say yes, it would be tailored slightly different for that particular entity, but it depends on what the entity is trying to achieve.
Thank you very much. Another question here. Is there room for departments to digitize their own records where those records are highly sensitive? So for example, the forensic lab. And follow up to that is, if not, in terms of the particular department digitizing their own records, if not, what processes will be put in place to maintain confidentiality?
That is a fairly good question. I know some entities has already started their own digitalization initiative in-house. I can also speak for my particular ministry. We have started actually digitizing our personnel records, which, as you mentioned before, is fairly confidential. We also brought in resources to actually help with that project, but what usually obtains or consider best practice is that if you're involving a vendor or outsider, they should sign a confidentiality clause just to at least protect the entity. But if it's obviously very, very sensitive information, you will want to make sure that you put the correct procedures in place so that that confidentiality will be maintained. But yes, some persons have started their own digitization in-house, but as I mentioned, you must have a plan. After you digitize, what's the next step? Are you going to just put those records, make them available electronically, or are they going to go in a system where they're actually secured and access and stuff is monitored and stuff like that? So I'd say yes, but it depends on how far you want to go.
Okay. And another interesting question coming in here, is the government considering investing in a central e-filing system to be used by all missions? If so, would there be a standard filing procedure in the way documents should be recorded? If not, can the mission implement their own?
That is a good question because we are now piloting an e-RMS, and which is actually an enterprise solution. So we actually want to roll out our e-RMS solutions to the entire public service. So I know there are some cases where some entities and stuff will have their own business information system, and they want to make it clear that the electronic document record management system relates to managing your correspondence. So if you are an entity and you're looking for a specific entity and you're looking for a specific software to manage your business process, that is something different. So I would say yes, we want to at least have some consistency in how we manage correspondence. But as it relates now to your business function or your business processes, where you need specialized software, the e-RMS is not necessarily a solution for you.
Okay,
so I just want to bear that in mind.
Okay. So one is asking, what does this digitization process now? What does it mean for registry staff? Will we see reductions since records will be online?
No, good question. We still need some form of of managing the records in the organization. Although the records are electronic, they still need to be managed. I must obviously stress on that point because although it's electronic, it still have to be managed in using records management principles and stuff. So that's why the training is important, and we really want to at least now have a cadre of officers who are trained in electronic records management, because it's a paradigm shift away from how we are accustomed dealing with records. So, and there's a role to be played by at least an entity within the agency managing that process. So you still definitely need a core group to manage electronic records. And I must speak for my agency again, the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Smart Technology. We have a core knowledge and information management team working along with all the other managers and stuff to make sure that the system and stuff is implemented smoothly. So there's definitely a role to be played by persons in the registry or the person managing the records.
Okay, great. I'm seeing here, and you probably would have touched on this a little bit earlier, where someone is also to asking, should closed volumes be digitized? And I want to lead that one on to with what happens with agencies whose legislation indicate their records should be kept more than 5 years.
That is a good question. I don't think I mentioned the whole concept of retention and disposition schedule, but best practice suggests that a retention and disposition schedule should be kept by all entities. And this is basically a plan where it details exactly how long a particular record or file should be kept, and then what happens afterwards. But because we never implemented we call it RDS for short, retention and disposition schedule, everything is basically kept indefinitely. which is not necessarily the case. So that is why now we are having a challenge identifying what records to digitize. But if that retention and disposition schedule was in place, we would know, for instance, that an easy one is usually accounting records. Accounting records based on the financial management act should be kept for around 7 years. So that is a given. But other categories of records, we don't know necessarily how long to keep them. We just close the file and place it in the cabinet, right? So it comes down now to the whole issue now of assessment, because in some cases, that particular record that is actually closed maybe of historical value, historical value to the entity. All historical records and stuff should actually be transferred to the archives. And a good example would, let me just put it in context. A good example would be the cabinet papers. All cabinet papers now are kept obviously at cabinet office, at least the originals and stuff. And a lot of those decisions and stuff of historical in nature. So technically speaking, all of our cabinet papers and stuff should be kept in the archive because they're of historical value. Right. So there's a case where there could be some information in the closed file that will be considered valuable, could be administrative, fiscal, operational, that should be digitized. So that's why the training is important going forward, where as we mentioned before, because expediency, we decided that we have a cutoff of 5 years. But with further training of personnel within the NDAs, we should be able now to have a clear picture in terms of what to digitize. And we can have a constant flow of records to be digitized in the next few months because of the training.
That's great. Excellent there from you. Another question here. Some filing is being done via the cloud or other systems. How can we ensure these systems are backed up, especially since persons have to have an account and password?
Yeah, that comes down to the whole issue of standards and policies. I know our ministry is presently working on cloud policy, soon to be rolled out. As the case, it depends on the policy too of the particular entity. So if you are actually backing up records and stuff on the cloud, you should actually have a plan in place of how that information will be backed up. So the good thing about cloud is that usually there's some form of redundancy in the cloud platform. So it's highly unlikely, it's all about risk management, highly unlikely that records could be lost. It could happen, but at least in most of the cloud applications, like I don't want to encourage persons to use things like storing government records in Dropbox and Google Drive, but but in some cases we also have our own solution in-house called OneDrive, OnCloud, which is being used by some officers across the public service, and that information is usually backed up. So in that case, you should always have a plan to back up the information. So if you're storing it on the cloud, at least the cloud should have, or the cloud provider should provide some form of redundancy so that at least your information is protected from loss or deletion.
Thank you there, Mr. Strawn again. Now, another question here. Is the organization responsible for their own digitization process? If the equipment is not available to the organization, for example, scanners, storage facilities, and even space that might be available, what would be the step of the public service?
Good question. As we will hear in the next couple of weeks, we're proposing to at least have a digitalization center created, and we want to do scanning on behalf of agencies. So although someone posed a question earlier in terms of digitizing their own records, we're really putting the framework in place where all the records and stuff will be transported to a central location to be digitized by a dedicated team. All right, so that plan is actually at the advanced stage. We already identified the building. We are just waiting approval for the Ministry of Housing, but we definitely want to have the options for agencies to basically touch base with the MIS and the project team and identify once the records are identified, clean, and stuff, the steps that were mentioned before. You can give us a call and we will basically put that process in train where the records can be transported for digitization. And also that would depend too on the rollout of EDRMS. So everything must be in sync. So after we digitize, we don't want a case where we digitize our records and then the records are sent back because you don't have a system in place as yet. So all that was taken in consideration.
Excellent. For those I had briefly mentioned a bit earlier, someone had asked about the digitization program guidelines, and it is now, I've actually been able to upload it in the chat, and so you can download it at your convenience. Colleagues, before we wrap up, that's all the time we've had here for this interesting presentation that Mr. Strawn would have delivered. And what I would want to say, Mr. Strawn, are there any final comments from you to the participants for here?
Yes, I want to again thank the Learning and Development Directorate for affording me the opportunity to at least share some of my knowledge and experience with my colleagues in the public service. I know this program is actually is very, very key going forward because, as mentioned before in the previous slides, we have some challenges in terms of some of our international indicators. And it basically proved the point that we definitely must now move to the next stage in terms of digital transformation. We are competing against colleagues in the region and around the world. And in able to be remain competitive, we must definitely take a serious look now at our public service. So the whole aim of the public sector modernization program is at least now put some resources now behind the government and the government entities and the government to at least transform a lot of our processes going forward. And it's going to be an interesting 4 years. The program is actually 4 years, so you will see a lot of changes now and start to happen already within the next couple of months into the next couple of years. So I actually look forward to interacting with you guys some more. As mentioned before, we will put together some other training opportunities, more specific training opportunities, so that we will make better choices and stuff relating to the records to be digitized. So you can listen now to hear more information on that training. So again, thank you very much. I truly enjoyed it. Just apologies for the technical glitch I had earlier, but other than that, I enjoyed the session. So thank you very much again, Shirley.
And thank you very much as well too, Mr. Strawn. Colleagues, that is all the time we have for our webinar today. And please look out for our follow-up email that will contain a copy of the recording of today's webinar and a PDF of the slides so that you can review any information that you missed. I still see some interesting questions coming in, and what we'll do is that we'll record those and ensure that we can get those back to you in a timely manner. A very informative and timely presentation that you have just delivered, Mr. Strawn. And to you, the participants, thanks as well for attending. Please ensure that you look out for you can view information on the Learning and Development Director. We now have a YouTube channel, and as well we would have given you a little sneak preview of our PRDS form, which is now going to be web-based. I would have seen 1 or 2 comments coming in there about those about that aspect. So colleagues, thanks very much again. Stay safe and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.